Hello and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wajenberg. This time we will conclude our reading of The Christmas Mouse by Miss Reed. Chapter 10. It was light when Mrs. Barry awoke. She lay inert in the warm bed, relishing its comfort as her bemused mind struggled with the memories of the night. The mouse and Stephen. What a double visitation, to be sure. No wonder she was tired this morning and had slept late. It must be almost 8 o'clock. Christmas morning, too. Where were the children? Where was Mary? The house was uncommonly quiet. She must get up and investigate. At that moment, she heard footsteps outside in the road and the sound of people greeting each other. Simultaneously, the church bell began to ring. Yes, it must be nearly 8 o'clock, and those good parishioners were off to early service. Well, thought Mrs. Barry philosophically, she would not be among the congregation. She rarely missed the 8 o'clock service, but after such a night she would be thankful to go later, at 11, taking the two little girls with her. She struggled up in bed and gazed at the sky. It was a glory of gray and gold. Streamers of ragged clouds, gilded at their edges, filled the world with a luminous radiance against which the bare twigs of the plum trees spread their black lace. She opened the window, remembering with a shudder the last time she had done so. Now the air, fresh and cool, lifted her hair. The bells sounded clearly as the neighbors' footsteps died away into the distance. "Awake, then?" said Mary, opening the door. "Happy Christmas!" She bore a cup of tea, the steam blowing towards her in the draught from the window. "You spoil me," said Mrs. Barry. "I ought to be up. Proper old sleepyhead I am today. Where are the children?" "Downstairs having breakfast. Not that they want much. They've been stuffing sweets and the tangerines from their stockings since 6. She put the cup on the bedside table and closed the window. "They wanted to burst in here, but I persuaded them to let you sleep on. What happened to the mouse? Is it still about? I see the trap sprung." "I let it out the window," said Mrs. Barry. She could not keep a touch of pride from her voice. "You never! You brave old dear! Where was it then?" "On the sill. I got so tired by about 3 I risked it and came up. I don't mind admitting I fair hated reaching over the little creature to get at the latch, but it made off in no time, so that was all right." "That took some pluck," said Mary, her voice warm with admiration. "Can I let those rascals come up now to show you their presents?" "Yes, please," said Mrs. Barry, reaching for her cup, "and I'll get up and give you a hand." Mary called down the staircase, and there was a thumping of feet and squeals and shouts as the two excited children struggled upstairs with their loot. "Look, Grandma!" shouted Frances. "I put on my slippers." "Look, Grandma!" shouted Jane. "Father Christmas brought me a dear little doll." They flung themselves upon the bed, Mary watching them with amusement. "Mind Gran's tea," she warned. "Leave them be," said her mother lovingly. "This is how Christmas morning should begin." Smiling, Mary let the three of them and went downstairs. On the doormat lay an envelope. Mary's heart sank as she bent to pick it up. Not another person they'd forgotten to send to. Not another case of Mrs. Burton all over again. Anyway, it was too late now to run about returning Christmas cards. Whoever had sent it must just be thanked when they met. She took it into the living room and stood with her back to the fire, studying the face of the envelope with some bewilderment. Most of the cards were addressed to Mrs. Barry and family, or to Mrs. Barry and Mrs. Fuller, but this was to Mrs. Bertie Fuller alone, and written in a firm hand. Wonderingly, Mary drew out the card. It was a fine reproduction of the Nativity by G. van Honhorst, and inside, beneath the printed Christmas greeting, was the signature of Ray Bullen. A small piece of writing paper fluttered to the ground as Mary, flushing with pleasure, studied the card. She stooped to retrieve it. The message it contained was simple and to the point. "I have 2 tickets for the New Year's Eve concert at the Corn Exchange. Can you come with me? Do hope so. Ray." Mary sat down with a thud on the chair recently vacated by young Jane. Automatically, she began stacking the girls' bowls sticky with cornflakes and milk. Her hands were shaking, she noticed, and she felt shame mingled with her happiness. "Like some stupid girl," she scolded herself, "instead of a widow with 2 children." She left the crockery alone and took up the note again. It was kind of him, typical of his thoughtfulness. Somehow he had managed to write the card after seeing her yesterday and had found someone in the village who would drop it through the letterbox on the way to early service. It must have taken some organizing, thought Mary, much touched. He was a good sort of man. Bertie had always said so, and this proved it. As for the invitation, that was a wonderful thing to have. She would love to go and knew that her mother would willingly look after the children. But would she approve? Would she think she was being disloyal to Bertie's memory to accept an invitation from another man? Fiddlesticks, thought Mary robustly, dismissing such mawkish sentiments. Here was an old friend offering to take her to a concert, that was all. It was a kindness that it would be churlish to rebuff. Of course she would go, and it would be a rare treat, too. Calmer, she rose and began to take the dishes into the kitchen, her mind fluttering about the age-old problem of what to wear on such a momentous occasion. There was her black, but it was too funereal, too widow-like. Suddenly she wanted to look gay, young, happy, to show that she appreciated the invitation, she told herself hastily. There was the yellow frock she had bought impulsively one summer day, excusing her extravagance by persuading herself it was just the thing for the Women's Institute outing to the theater. But when the evening had arrived, she had begun to have doubts. Was it perhaps too gay for a widow? Would the tongues wag? Would they say she was after someone? Mutton dressed as lamb? She had put it back in the cupboard and dressed herself in the black one. Better be on the safe side, she had told herself dejectedly, and had felt miserable the whole evening. Yes, the yellow frock should have an airing, and her bronze evening shoes an extra shine. Ray Bullen should have no cause to regret his invitation. She turned on the tap as the children came rushing into the room. "Why, Mummy!" exclaimed Frances, wide-eyed with amazement. "You're singing!" Upstairs, Mrs. Barry put on her gray woolen jumper and straightened the Welsh tweed skirt. This was her working outfit. Later in the morning, she would change into more elegant attire suitable for church going, but there was housework to be done in the next hour or two. Last of all, she tied a blue and white spotted apron round her waist and was ready to face the day. Once more, she opened the window. The small birds chirped and chatted below, awaiting their morning crumbs. A gray and white wagtail teetered back and forth across a puddle, looking for all the world like a miniature curate with his white collar and dove gray garments. The yellow winter jasmine starred the wall below, forerunner of the aconites and snowdrops soon to come. There was a hopeful feeling of spring in the air, decided Mrs. Barry, gazing at the sky. How different from yesterday's gloom. The children's happiness was infectious. Their delight in the simple presence warmed the old lady's heart and set her thinking of that other child, less fortunate, who had no real family of his own and who had wept because of it. How was he faring? Had he, after all, found a watch among his parcels? Mrs. Barry doubted it. The Roses had spoken truly when they told the child that a watch was too much to expect at Christmas. No doubt lesser presents would make him happy, assuaging some of the extent of that fierce longing to have a watch like Patsy's and Jim's. A passionate child, thought Mrs. Barry, shaking her head sadly. Pepe all over again. It made life hard for the boy, and harder still for those who had to look after him. Would he ever remember any of the good advice she had tried to offer? Knowing the ways of children, she suspected that most of her admonitions had gone in one ear and out the other. Ah, well, one could only hope, she thought, descending the staircase. Mary had set a tray at the end of the table for her mother. Beyond it stood the pink cyclamen and a pile of parcels. The two children, hopping from leg to leg with excitement, hovered on each side of the chair. "Come on, Gran, come and see what you've got. Mum gave you the plant." "Mary," exclaimed Mrs. Barry, hands in the air with astonishment, "you shouldn't have spent so much money on me. What a beauty! And so many buds to come out, too. Well, I don't know when I've seen a finer cyclamen, and that's a fact." She kissed her daughter warmly. Why, the girl seemed to glow. Christmas was a comforting time for young and old, thought Mrs. Barry, reaching out for the parcels. "Open mine first," demanded Frances. "No, mine," said Jane. "I'm the oldest." "I'll open them together," said the old lady, taking one in each hand. "See, I'll tear a bit off this one and then a bit off that one." She tugged at the wrappings gently. "No, no," cried Jane, unable to bear the delay. "Do one first, doesn't matter which, then the other, but read the tags. We wrote 'em ourselves." Mrs. Barry held the two tags at arm's length. Her spectacles were mislaid among the Christmas debris. Darling Grandma, with love from Jane, she read aloud. She shook the parcel, then smelled it, then held it to her ear. The children hugged each other in rapture. Why do you listen to it? Queried Frances. Do you think there's a bird in it? A watch, perhaps, said Mrs. Barry, surprised by her own words. A watch, screamed the girls, but you've got a watch. So I have, said Mrs. Barry calmly. Well, let's see what's in here. Wrapped in 4 thicknesses of tissue paper was a little egg timer. Now that, cried the old lady, is exactly what I wanted. Clever Jane. She kissed the child's soft cheek. Now mine, begged Frances. Quick, undo it, quick, Gran. I must read the tag. Dear Gran, Happy Christmas, Frances. Very nice. Undo it, said the child. Obediently, the old lady undid the paper. Inside was a box of peppermint creams. My favorite sweets, said Mrs. Barry. What a kind child you are. Would you like one now? Yes, please, said both in unison. I hoped you'd give us one, said Frances, beaming. Isn't it lucky we like them too? Very lucky, agreed their grandmother, proffering the box. Let Gran have her breakfast, do, Mary said, appearing from the kitchen. But she's got lots more parcels to open. I shall have a cup of tea first, said the old lady, and then undo them. Sighing at such maddening adult behavior, the 2 children retired to the other end of the table, where they had set out a tiny metal tea set of willow pattern in blue and white. This is my favorite present, announced Frances, and the teapot pours. See? Mary and her mother exchanged amused glances. The set had been one of several small toys they had bought together in Caxley to fill up the stockings. The chief present for each girl had been a doll, beautifully dressed in handmade clothes, worked on secretly when the girls were in bed. It was typical of children the world over that some trifle of no real value should give them more immediate pleasure than the larger gifts. At last, all the presents were unwrapped. Bath cubes, stockings, handkerchiefs, sweets, a tin of biscuits, another of tea, and a tablecloth embroidered by Mary, all were displayed and admired. Mary's presents had to be brought from the sideboard and shown to her mother to please the 2 children, despite the fact that Mrs. Barry had seen most of them before. Now, what's to do in the kitchen? Asked Mrs. Barry, rising from the table. Nothing. The pudding's in, and the bird is ready, and the vegetables. Then I'll dust and tidy up, declared Mrs. Barry. Upstairs first. I can guess what the girls' rooms look like. At least there are no mice, laughed Mary. The children looked up alert. No mice? Was there a mouse? Where is it now? Their grandmother told them about the intruder and how she had settled by the fire, but at last gone up to bed and had let the mouse out of the window. What would they have said, she wondered, as she told her tale, if she had told them the whole story? How their eyes would have widened at the thought of a boy, a big boy of 9, breaking into their home and trying to steal their grandmother's Madeira cake. As it was, the story of the real mouse stirred their imagination. I expect it was hungry, said Jane with pity. I expect it smelled all the nice Christmas food and came in to have a little bit. It had plenty of its own sort of food outdoors, Mrs. Barry reported tartly. Perhaps it just wanted to see inside a house, suggested Frances reasonably. You shouldn't have frightened it away, Gran. It frightened me away, the old lady said. Perhaps it will come back, said Jane hopefully. That, said her grandmother forcefully, I sincerely hope it will not do. And she went upstairs to her duties. When the children and her mother had departed to church, the house was blessedly quiet. Mary, basting the turkey and turning potatoes in the baking dish, had time to ponder her invitation. As soon as the children were safely out of the way, she would have a word with their mother, then reply. But where should she send it? There had been no address on the note, and although she knew the part of Caxley in which Ray lived, she could not recall the name of the road and certainly had no idea of the number. Perhaps the best thing would be to send it to the office of the Caxley Chronicle, where he worked. He would be going into work, no doubt, on the day after Boxing Day, plenty of time to prepare for New Year's Eve. Now that the first initial surprise of the invitation was over, Mary found herself growing more and more delighted at the thought of the evening outing. Caxley had produced a New Year's Eve concert as long as she could remember, and she and Bertie had attended several of them. The Corn Exchange was always full. It was something of an occasion. The mayor came, all the local gentry sat in the front rows, and everyone knew that the music provided would be good rousing stuff by Handel and Bach and Mozart, and maybe a light sprinkling of Gilbert and Sullivan or Edward German or Lionel Monckton as a garnish. It was definitely a social affair when one wore one's best and hoped to see one's friends and be seen by them. It would be good, thought Mary, to have a personable man as an escort instead of attending a function on her own. Kind Ray, good Quaker Ray. How did that passage go in the library book? Very thoughtful and wealthy and good. She could vouch for two of those virtues anyway. She slammed the oven door shut and laughed aloud. At 1 o'clock, the Christmas dinner, everything done to a turn, was set upon the table, and the two little girls attacked their plates with enviable appetite. Their elders ate more circumspectly. Nevertheless, at 2 o'clock, it was the children who played energetically on the floor with their new toys, whilst Mary and her mother lay back in their armchairs and succumbed to that torpor induced by unaccustomed rich food. We must take a turn in the fresh air before it gets dark, Mrs. Barry yawned. Mary nodded agreement drowsily. They woke at 3, much refreshed, donned their coats and gloves, and set off. The bright clouds of morning had gone, the gentle gray light veiled a distant scene. The four of them walked toward the slope where young Stephen had walked scarcely 12 hours earlier. Mrs. Barry's mind was full of memories of her Christmas visitor. She strode along, dwelling on the oddity of events that had brought one of the Aminetti family into her life once more. Ahead of her, holding a child by each hand, Mary was running a few steps, then stopping suddenly to bring the two children face to face in an ecstatic embrace. It was a game they had loved as toddlers, but it was years, thought Mrs. Barry, since Mary had played it with them. Their delighted screams matched the calling of the flight of rooks above, slowly winging homewards against the evening sky. Now they had reached the top of the slope, and Mary, breathless, stopped to wait for her mother. They stood together looking across the shallow valley, already filling with the pale mist of winter. That's Tupp's Hill over there, isn't it? Said Mary. Her mother nodded. Do you remember the roses? Vaguely, said Mary. Why? There was an intensity about her mother's gaze that made Mary curious. The old lady did not answer for a moment, her eyes remaining fixed upon the shadowy hill beyond the rising mist. I might call on them one day, she said at last. Not yet a while, but some day. Some day, perhaps. She turned suddenly. Let's go home, Mary dear. There's no place like it, and it's getting cold. Chapter 11. It was hardly surprising at tea time to find that the family's appetite was small despite the afternoon walk. I'll just bring in the Christmas cake, said Mary, and the tea tray, though I expect you'd like a slice of your Madeira, wouldn't you? No, thank you, replied Mrs. Barry hastily. She pondered on the fate of the Madeira cake as Mary clattered china in the kitchen. It certainly seemed a terrible waste of sugar and butter and eggs, not to mention the beautiful curl of Angelica that cost dear knows how much these days. But there it was. The thought of those pink paws touching it was enough to put anyone off the food. Perhaps she could cut off the outside and slice the rest for a trifle? Waste was something that Mrs. Barry abhorred. But at once she dismissed the idea. It was no good. The cake must go. No doubt the birds would relish it, but she must find an opportunity for disposing of it when Mary was absent from the scene. Explanations would be difficult under the circumstances. Mary returned with the tray. To the accompaniment of cries of appreciation from the children, the candles were lighted on the Christmas tree and at each end of the mantelpiece. Outside, the early dusk had fallen, and the shadowy room, lit by a score of flickering candle flames and the glow from the fire, had never looked so snug and magical, thought Mrs. Barry. If only their menfolk could have been with them. She shook away melancholy as she had done so often. The time for grieving was over. There was much to be thankful for. She looked at Mary, intent upon cutting the snowy cake, and the rosy children, their eyes reflecting the light from the candles, and she was content. And that child at Tupp's Hill, was he as happy as her own? She had a feeling that he might be, that perhaps he had been able to let the Christmas spirit soothe his anxious heart. Jane's Christmas cracker had yielded a tiny spinning top that had numbers printed on it. When it came to rest after being twirled on the table, the number that was uppermost gave the spinner his score. This simple toy provided part of the evening's playtime, and all four played. Later, Mrs. Barry played Ludo with the children, a new game found in Frances' pillow slip, while Mary wrote some thank you letters. By 7 o'clock, both children were yawning, although they did their best to hide this weakness from the grown ups. It would be terrible to miss anything on this finest day of the year. Bed, said Mary firmly, and as the wails greeted her dictum, she relented enough to say, "You can take your toys upstairs and play with them for a little while." Within half an hour, they were safely in bed, and Mary and her mother sat down to enjoy the respite from the children's clamor. "Why, there's a new Christmas card!" exclaimed Mrs. Barry, her eye lighting on Mary's from Ray. Mary rose to fetch it from the mantelpiece and handed it to her mother. "Someone dropped it through the letter box first thing this morning. I bumped into Ray yesterday when we were shopping, and he helped us on the bus with our parcels." "Typical of the Bullens," commented Mrs. Barry, studying the card with approval. "I knew his mother when she was young, a nice girl." Mary took a breath. This seemed as propitious a time as any other to mention the invitation. "There is a note somewhere. He has asked me to go to the New Year's Eve concert. Would you mind? Looking after the girls, I mean?" "Good heavens, no. I'm glad to think of you getting out a little. You'll enjoy an evening with Ray Bullen," said her mother easily. Mrs. Barry leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes. It had been a long day, and she was near to sleep. A jumble of impressions, bright fragments of the last 24 hours, jostled together in her tired mind like the tiny pieces of colored glass in a child's kaleidoscope. Stephen's mousy face, his pink hand spread like a starfish upon his knee with a shining tear upon it. Her own shadow, poker in hand, monstrously large on the passage wall as she approached the unknown intruder. A furry scrap crouched on the window sill with the wild weather beyond. Stephen's resolute back vanishing round the bend of the lane as he marched home. The reflection of the candles in her grandchildren's eyes. The candles in the church, dozens of them today, and the sweet, clear voices of the choir boys. She woke with a jerk. The clock showed that she had slept for 10 minutes. Her last impression still filled her mind. "It was lovely in church this morning," she said to Mary. "Flowers and candles and the boys singing so sweetly. You should have come." "I will next Sunday," Mary promised. "A New Year's resolution, Mum." There was a quiet happiness about Mary that did not escape Mrs. Barry's eyes, but in her wisdom she said nothing. Things she knew in her bones were falling delicately and rightly into place. "I'll go and tuck up the girls," said Mrs. Barry, struggling from her chair, "and switch off their light." She mounted the stairs and was surprised to see that both children were in her own room. They were kneeling on her bed, very busy with something on the windowsill. They turned at her approach. "We're just putting out a little supper for the Christmas mouse," explained Jane. On the ledge was one of the doll's tin willow pattern plates. On it were a few crumbs of Christmas cake and one or two holly berries. "They're apples for him," said Frances. "When people call, you should always offer them refreshments, Mummy says." Mrs. Barry remembered the steaming bowl of bread and milk clutched against a duffel coat. "She's quite right," she said, smiling at them, "but somehow I don't think that mouse will come back." Stephen's dwindling figure striding away came before her eyes. The children looked at her, suddenly forlorn. She offered swift comfort. "But I'm sure of one thing, that Christmas mouse will remember his visit here for the rest of his life." The rising moon silvered the roofs at Shepherd's Cross and turned the puddles into mirrors. The sky was cloudless. Soon the frost would come, furring the grass and hedges, glazing the cattle troughs and water butts. Dick Rose at Tupp's Hill was glad to get back to the fireside after shutting up the hens for the night. The table had been pushed back against the wall, and the three children were crawling about the floor, engrossed in a clockwork train that rattled merrily around a maze of lines set all over the floor. Betty sat watching them, as delighted as they were in its bustling maneuvers. "It's only fell over once," said Stephen proudly, looking up at his foster father's entrance. "Good," said Dick. He never wasted words. "Are you sad Father Christmas never brought you a watch?" asked Patsy of Stephen. Dick's eyes met his wife's. Patsy was still young enough to believe in the myth, and the boys had nobly resisted enlightening her. Stephen turned dark eyes upon her. Never thought about it, he lied bravely. I've got all this, haven't I? He picked up the little train and held it whirring close to his face. He turned and smiled, the radiant, warm smile of his lost father, upon his foster parents. You're a good kid, said Dick gruffly. Your birthday ain't far off. For the first time since Stephen's tempestuous arrival, he thought suddenly, the boy seemed part of the family. There was a stirring beneath the third bush in the hawthorn hedge. A sharp nose pushed aside the ground ivy leaves, and the mouse emerged into the moonlight. It paused, sniffing the chill air, then ran through the dry grass by the shed, negotiated the mossy step by the wellhead, and stopped to nibble a dried seed pod. On it ran again, parting the crisp grass with its sinuous body, diving down ruts, scrambling up slopes until it gained the wet earth behind the wallflower plants. Between the plants and the brick wall of the cottage it scampered until it reached the foot of the rose bush, where it stopped abruptly. Far, far above it, lights glowed from the windows. A tremor shook its tiny frame. Its nose and whiskers quivered at the sense of danger, and it turned to double back on its tracks, away from the half-remembered terrors of an alien world. It hurried out into the moonlight and made for the open field beyond the hawthorn hedge. There, among the rimy grass and the sweet familiar scents, its panic subsided. Nibbling busily, safely within darting distance of its hole, the Christmas mouse was at peace with its little world. The end.